much for having me. I'm really excited to be here. So so let's talk about the census. Some of you are probably familiar with it. You may have gotten an invitation in the mail that's inviting you to fill it out online, which is very exciting. But just want to take a step back and talk about why the census is important in the first place. So the census happens every 10 years. It's the data from the census is how we allocate federal funds for on a yearly basis. So those federal funds include education programs. It includes Medicaid, Medicare, SNAP, the free lunches in schools, a whole bunch of programs that are extremely important to not only your everyday life, but it also really fits into kind of how you think about your political representation and also like additional things that you see in your community. So census data is also how we draw congressional lines and determine the number of House of Representatives and our electoral votes. And then the other thing census data does is our local communities are looking at it to determine where we need to build schools, the infrastructure. So if you have really bad roads in your neighborhood, it's part of that is also thinking through how many people are living in a certain area and where we need to build more roads to fill that capacity on the road. But the other thing about the census that makes it a little bit different than, say, voting is that you count everyone. So it's every person that's living in the US, regardless of citizenship or legal status. You're counting the people that are here. So that really helps understand who's in your community and why it's important. And so the reason it's so important is so much can change in 10 years. So I'll say that 10 years ago, I was in college and I don't remember filling out my form. I have no idea if I even got a form. I tell people maybe I threw it away because I didn't know what it was. And I think that's true for a lot of people. And so it's really important that we are able to talk about the census and why it matters so that college students in particular find usefulness and will fill it out. So just a little bit about how college students are counted. So obviously things are a little bit different given the coronavirus situation and a lot of colleges and universities shutting down, and a lot of people here, and I'm assuming on the phone as well, are either working from home or they themselves, if you're in a college and university, have had to leave and go home. And so the way that the census usually works is through group quarters enumeration. And basically the Census Bureau has contacted your administrators at universities ahead of time to ask, how do you want to get counted? And the way it works is that the university administrators decide if they want to just give the data. They'll give all of the information for students that live on campus. So they can just fill in the information automatically, or they can opt out and actually have students fill out their own census forms. And from what we know right now, about 35% of universities have done that, have requested the forms go to the university students. So given the coronavirus situation, a lot of that has changed. So what the Census Bureau is doing now is going back to all of those university administrators and asking them to rethink if they want to still have their students fill out the forms themselves, or if they want to just give the information from administrative records that they have. And so that's really important too, because some of you may have already been counted by your university. If you haven't, and your university was part of that 35% that wanted to have students fill them out themselves, then it's important that you're working with your university and also like understanding what your university plans are moving forward to ensure that people on campus are getting counted. So a couple of things to note is that the group quarters enumeration only is relevant for people that live on campus or in on-campus housing, so dorms, et cetera. But if you are off campus, so if you live in like a house, you attend the university, but you live off campus in an apartment or house, you need to fill it out just like everyone else, where you get a letter of invitation in the mail and you fill it out there. A couple of quick things. Even if you're at home, you should still fill out your form as if you live at the university. again, you're kind of a representation of a person over the next 10 years. So even if right now you're at home and you're not at the university, there will be a person that will be at that university in 3 months or over the next 10 years. So thinking about the way that resources are distributed, if we want to make sure that people are counted where they're at the majority of the time so that those resources are actually adequately distributed. And when you're thinking about representation and who's going to represent you, you want to have a certain number of people that are counted where they're at so that they get that equal representation as well. So that's kind of a very broad overview, but I wanted to leave it kind of a little open for just general questions about the census. It is a very big topic and it can be a little daunting, but there's a lot of great things that come from it. I like to also use the example of, so I live in Washington, D.C. If there's any people from D.C. on the line. And I go to the grocery store near my house, and we have a really large Latinx population here. And there's a lot of really great food that you can find at the grocery store that's specific to the communities around where I live. And so that's really cool. And I never really understood like how they knew where to have certain foods, but a lot of businesses also look at that data from the census to figure out like, oh, okay, cool, there's a large Asian population here. We should have more Asian foods at the grocery store. And I'm not just talking about like an Asian market. I'm talking about like a Safeway or a Giant or a Harris Teeter. Like they look at that data to then figure out where they should have specific foods, which is also really cool. So anyways, I could talk about the census forever because I like it. It's interesting. But I want to leave it open in case people have questions. I'll say one more thing. This census is different than in the past. If you do remember 10 years ago filling it out or helping your family fill it out, it was a paper questionnaire. This is the first census that is predominantly online. So most people are going to get an invitation in the mail that has like a code, and then you go online and you fill in the code and fill out your form. And it's super easy. I did it last week while in quarantine, and it was very simple, and also recommending to people if you're really bored, which gets very boring, this is something to do, but it takes like 4 minutes. So simple and easy. But it is online for the first time, which is really, really great. But if for folks that are not interested in filling it out online, you can wait till the 4th reminder, and they'll send you a paper form with that 4th reminder. But there are a lot of people that are uncomfortable filling it out online, or maybe have issues with their Wi-Fi, so they can fill it out in using the paper form. Cool. So I see some questions coming in. So yes, so coronavirus has impacted the census. So there's a lot of different operations. So for example, for group quarters enumeration, part of like counting people on campuses is also following up with those students that that would receive the form. So that 35% I talked about, following up with them with people that come and like knock on your doors. Those are enumerators. So that follow-up for people that never filled out their form has to be in person. And so what they've done is they originally were going to have that in early April, and they've moved it to April 13th. That's not that far off. Like I think they'll still probably extend it, but a lot of the changes to census operations have been due to coronavirus. One thing I would say is that because there is the option to fill it out online, you can call and fill it out as well. So you can call and do it by phone and then by mail. Of course, like I said, during the 4th mailing, they'll have the paper questionnaire. There's a lot of other options for ways to fill it out, and you don't necessarily have to interact one-on-one with someone until, unless you have not filled it out in any of those ways come May. So what the Census Bureau has done so far is started to extend those deadlines. So originally non-response follow-up when they send enumerators door to door, that was supposed to start May 13th. That's now going to start at the end of May. So you're going to see some of these shifts in operations due to coronavirus, and they'll continue to shift just based on the health and safety and assessing that in real time. So yes, there have been some changes. Oh, I was going to actually send this through the chat box because I think it's helpful, but also actually I don't think that's the one I wanted to share. That might be something else, but let me share this. Great. So if you click on the second link, it's the Census Bureau's fact sheet on the operational adjustments. So you can take a look at that. Okay, sorry, I'm going to take some other questions too. Great. So besides congressional districts, what are typical ways that census data is used? So yeah, so again, I mentioned the businesses and how businesses look at it to determine like race and ethnicity of an area and how they can better serve their communities or their customers, really. But there's some other ways that census data is used. So a lot of those federal programs, I think it's close to $1 trillion a year is allocated to federal program or through federal programs, and they're only looking at census data. So that's really important because, so say you have a family member that depends on Medicaid or Medicare, if those numbers are incorrect, then there's going to be less per state. So you're not going to have as much you're not going to have as much per state, and then that will be less per person. And that's really, really important because if there is an undercount and they realize later there's an undercount, they're not going to change the data or update it. They're only going to use the data that they get during that one-time census. So it's very, very important. And then I know we have to fill out the census as a household. Should I be filling out the census on behalf of my roommate? Do we need to sit down together? I would say yes, sit down together. It's really important to allow people to self-identify. Race and the other questions that are on the form are very specific to you. So if you can sit down with your roommate and fill it out together, that would be good. And if you can't sit down in person together, then maybe reach out and try to like communicate and coordinate on that. They will send out people this year. They will send out enumerators. They'll just be sending them out later, and they're just going to continue to reassess when they need to send those folks out based on how healthy things are. So yeah, like I said, most of those enumerators are were supposed to go out on May 13th to start door knocking on people that hadn't responded, but now they're setting it for May 28th, and we'll reassess as coronavirus continues. What are the main ways the census shapes K-12 education? So I wouldn't say necessarily it's shaping education as much as it is money for schools and funding. So for example, when you're looking at like a certain area and basing your population and figuring out how much or how many schools in an area need to be built to accommodate the population in an area, you're going to be looking and seeing, okay, during the census in 2010, we had this amount of kids in the 0 to 4 population. What does that mean in 5 years when they're entering into primary and secondary education, et cetera? So like thinking through the numbers and how children are counted can account for like how many schools need to be built, and kind of thinking through those population estimates is extremely important. And so a lot of states are looking at that data. The other thing to say is that the census is the only, it's the largest comprehensive data set that we have. So if you, I don't know if any of you use ArcGIS or have used that. I used to have to use it. Very fun, but also complicated. But most of any type of data layer comes from census data, and it's the only large comprehensive data set that we have. Is there easy or accessible language we can use to share the college info with our peers? I've been seeing the census challenge on Instagram. Would love to find ways to explain this. Yeah, so there are a lot of really great organizations. I'm going to pitch my own organization because we do have a lot of resources. But if you go to censuscounts.org, you can check out a lot of different resources that are being pulled together. I know that the organization Students Learn, Students Vote has been doing a lot around census as well, and very specific to colleges and universities. We are also working to pull together some really easy videos and graphics so that it's a little easier to talk about, because census can be pretty wonky. But we are, we have those. And then speaking of like language, there's a lot of in-language resources for the various AAPI languages, Spanish. We also work with a lot of immigrant rights organizations that translate into other languages as well. So you can find all of those resources on censuscounts.org if you're interested. Is there any way that the changes in the census will make it less accurate? That's a really great question. So one thing to know is that you'll hear about April 1, which is next week, very exciting, which is Census Day 2020. April 1 is used as a marker of a way to kind of center yourself. So for example, if you are living in an apartment and you're moving March 31st, and then you'll be living in a new apartment April 1st, the census wants you to count yourself where you are on April 1. There's some caveats to that, of course. So like if you are if you share custody of a child, for example, or say you're a university student and you are technically at your parents' house on April 1, they want you to count yourself where you are the majority of the time. So it only works, the only way they really want you to use April 1 as a marker is if you're unsure because you're spending half and half time somewhere or you're moving to a new location. But if you spend the majority of your time in a place, they want you to use that. So anyways, the whole point of me saying that is that April 1 is a marker, and the further away you get from that date, when you're filling out your census form, the harder it is to remember where you were on April 1, right? So if you did move, you may have forgotten, did I move on April 1 or did I move on April 15th? Things like that. So the thing to remember is that as they extend the census deadline, and if they have door-to-door enumerators going out to ask people to fill it out, they may not remember the April 1 date as like that marker. And so it could make the census data less accurate. They've only extended it 2 weeks from what the end date was supposed to be, but it could change given coronavirus. So we'll just keep that in mind and see how it is. Have any of the race or ethnicity categories changed since 2010? Yes, great question. So the race and ethnicity question has expanded. If any of you have filled out the form, you can see that under both the white and black categories, you can list out more specifically your ethnic background. There's just more generally choices on how to be more specific with your ethnicity, which is really great. One thing that has not been included still is the Middle Eastern North African category, which is something that a lot of organizations and people in general are fighting for. So hopefully we will see that on the 2030 census. I think that's all the questions I see, but if anyone else has a question, I'm happy to answer it. Does the U.S. Census allow Puerto Rico to participate? Yes, they do. And they actually have some special operations right now in Puerto Rico, given that they're still recovering from the hurricane. So a lot has shifted there. So they are doing a lot more in-person enumeration. But yes, Puerto Rico does participate. Cool. So, go ahead.
So if that's it on questions for Sonum, thank you so much. We're going to transition. So we have Paige Moskowitz here, who is the founder and head of Columbia Votes, which was heading up all of Columbia University's census initiatives and is now transitioning online. So she's going to give kind of a TLDR on digital organizing for the census and sort of campus outreach strategies that we can all use to make sure that our fellow classmates are still filling out the census.
Great, thanks, Megan. So yeah, as Megan said, my name is Paige. I'm a senior at Columbia. I study the census. I'm a history major, and I study the census a lot in like my research. So if you have any questions about history of the census, HMU, it's my fave topic. But like Megan said, I was working with different offices on campus about census outreach on campus. And now that has all gone digital because of coronavirus. Students have moved off campus. It's a really fun time. So like Sonum said, there's different ways college students fill out the census. About half of the colleges and universities in the US are doing e-response, meaning that they are submitting information to the Census Bureau on their students' behalf for people who live on campus in campus housing. The rest of colleges have different operations happening where basically they were going to have paper forms that students could come fill out. That's not happening anymore. We're all off campus for the most part. So it's really shifting to digital organizing. First thing, I have a Google Doc I'm going to share with y'all that just kind of like has what I'm talking about on it. I'm a visual person, so I like reading along as someone is talking, and maybe that's also you. So let me drop it in the chat. So yeah. The first part of the doc just kind of goes over like, what is the digital census? How is coronavirus affecting the census, and why is digital organizing so much more important? And in general, just why is organizing for the census important? Historically, there are groups of people in the United States who are just consistently undercounted in the census. They are not given their full representation and therefore aren't giving the full assistance and funding that are needed. This includes college students and young children, immigrant populations, undocumented people, people of color, communities of color specifically tend to be really undercounted. Rural areas tend to be undercounted. There's just lots of groups of people in the United States who aren't counted, and they should be. So this year, Census Organizing has really stepped up in the form of outreach and partnerships. Those are taken digitally. The way the census is doing it is through census community partners and supporters. So they are partnering with businesses, churches, synagogues, nonprofits, libraries, recreational centers, just anything and everything that serves communities, and working with those organizations to help make sure to working with those organizations who are then in turn saying, we're going to make an effort to have the people that we serve fill out the census. So the way it was going to happen, you know, was like traditional gatherings and events where everyone would come together physically and fill out the census. That's not happening now. The way that coronavirus is affecting the census is really interesting, but just provides some great opportunities for problem solving and creative thinking of saying, how are we going to count everyone? So there's a couple of ways to digitally organize. The first way is just like, as usual, your direct contact, tried and true, of talking with your friends and family, posting on social media, just verbally getting the word out digitally about the census, when it's happening, why it's important. There are a lot of great graphics online that you can use to like repost of why the census is important, how to fill it out, etc. I'm happy to share some of those. Like I mentioned, there's these census community partners and supporters. I have a link here where you can look up all of the listed partners across the United States. They're in every state. They have it organized by congressional districts, so they're also in like every congressional district. If you're interested in working for the census, I would highly recommend reaching out to a community partner and seeing if there's anything you can do to support them and their efforts, because they most likely already have some structure in place and some organization in place and probably may just need people power to get it done. You also can work for the census as like in the Census Bureau officially. They hire a lot of part-time workers every year. They are still hiring at the moment, even with delayed operations. So you can go online to the Census Bureau nationally and like apply for jobs there, or you could also contact your local census office and see what work you can do with remotely, digitally, like working locally in your community. Basically, the census is kind of just like an all hands on deck operation of everyone needs to be counted in the United States. It's really important for a plethora of reasons. And just like, how do we make sure that we're hitting communities that are historically undercounted? Because in turn, those people who are undercounted usually would benefit from having the assistance and funds available to them if their full population is actually recorded. That was kind of a lot. It was very broad in general. So if y'all have any questions, happy to answer them in general about just changes in the census outreach nowadays, and specifically like how college students and students in general are counted in the census and where they should be filling it out.
Thanks, Paige. That's super interesting. Yes, do share graphics, because I'm trying to start the census challenge on my Instagram once this test optional stuff dies down.
Social media is great. The census partnered with Tasty to like put together videos about the census. They're really just like reaching out in general. They had like paid content on Twitter. It's actually, side note, the marketing history of the census is really interesting because they didn't start professional marketing until the 2000 census. So before that, it was just pure community outreach, relying on like the goodwill of news networks to like say, oh, by the way, the census is happening. So this like really concerted effort to get the word out about the census on behalf of the Census Bureau is relatively new. And in turn, there's also a really big problem with misinformation about the census and what the Census Bureau is doing to combat that. Yeah.
Well, if no one else has any more questions, I think then that's it for us today. Merritt, do you want to give everybody a preview of the next call in the community call series?
I'll let Emmy do that because she's more familiar with the whole schedule. But yeah, I know our first call will be on Sunday on the test optional now campaign, but there's lots more content.
Yeah, the test optional now one is going to be particularly awesome on Sunday. If anyone's interested in the social community series more broadly, that's being put on by Future Coalition and a bunch of partners like Student Voice. Tomorrow we have a session on the role of art and activism and the intersections between them. On Friday we have one about Indigenous leadership, youth leadership, and then there's like some fun ones this weekend, like a trivia night and another hangout. And then next week we have yoga. There's so much awesome stuff. So I'll drop the link to the schedule in the chat.
And if you haven't looked at the test optional now petition, we'll drop the link to that in the chat here. Please give it a look and sign it. We're calling it Student Voice is leading a coalition of student-led organizations that are calling for higher education institutions to adopt test optional policies for this year's juniors who have been impacted by SAT and ACT cancellations. So Barrett just dropped that link in the chat if you want to take a look at that and give it a sign.